Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, today I've seen a ghost.
You've seen a ghost? Where? Who was it?
I saw the spirit when I was paying my respects at the cemetery. It was the recently passed monk. I believe they just completed his 49-day memorial very recently.
Indeed they did. I've heard tell of other monks seeing him in their dreams as well. I wonder what the dreams in your vision all mean.
It must mean that he has successfully passed through to his next rebirth. In his great wisdom and command of causes and conditions, he has sent us all a signal that he has successfully been reborn in the next realm, and has not lost his way and fallen into perdition.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing spirits and ghosts. If there's no soul in Buddhism, how do we account for spirits and ghosts? Why is this important? How does this affect how Buddhism is practiced across East Asia? So, let's get into it. If there is no soul in Buddhism, how do we account for spirits and ghosts?
There are many varied understandings of what exactly happens whenever a person dies in Buddhism, but we will talk about some of the most common ones here. You'll note that there are some important commonalities between these different conceptions of death, and they will also build on what's been discussed in past episodes where the issue of death in Buddhism has come up, such as episode 16. First off, we should remark that most, if not all, of the cultures in which Buddhism exists in East Asia had a conception of some immaterial spirit or apparition of a person that lasted beyond the death of that person's physical body. And that is a huge reason why spirits and ghosts exist in the Buddhist tradition. It is because the culture had that conception prior to the arrival of Buddhism, and Buddhism sort of adapted to it and around it. We've talked at length about how Buddhist doctrine has a unique way of localizing to the specific culture where it finds itself, and death doctrines are probably the most stark example of this very process. That being the case, we should mark this as one of the reasons why we see spirits and ghosts in Buddhism. There's a second reason that this first reason actually points to as well. There is a remarkable gap between texts and ritual and lived religion. I and countless other Buddhism studies scholars like me spend nearly all of our time reconciling the discrepancy that exists between what is written on the page, if we can all even agree about that, which we usually cannot, and what is done out there in the world, either in the past or in the present. This gap can be partially bridged by understanding that Buddhism localizes, but it doesn't cover it all. The rest of that gap is so granular and particular and specific to each and every place that Buddhism has localized that we cannot begin to explain it here on this show. We can only point out that it's there. We're talking about economic reasons, we're talking about practical reasons, geographical reasons, we're talking about history reasons, all kinds of reasons that are not related to Buddhism or to the existing cultural practices and indigenous religions in those places. So those two reasons alone, the extenuating circumstances and the unique ability of Buddhism to localize, cannot completely account for spirits and ghosts in Buddhism. To say that ghosts and spirits are only an issue of cultural localization or of specific circumstance ignores some very real doctrines and practices that develop in Buddhism as it grows and develops and travels across East Asia. So let's get specific. You said it right at the beginning. There is no everlasting and unchanging soul in Buddhism. The everlasting soul is something that, at the time of the early development of Buddhism in India, was believed to be true by Brahmanical Hindu traditions, but was entirely rejected by the Buddha and his disciples. So, that being the case, one would think that there would be no possibility of the existence of ghosts or spirits in Buddhist doctrine, because in the West, we have a strong association between our conception of the soul and of what ghosts actually are. There's a strong connection between the Judeo-Christian conception of the soul and the Western conception of the ghost. And while that is the case, this is largely true in Indian Buddhism. There is actually little to no conception of ghosts or spirits in early Indian Buddhism. There is, of course, the five skandha scheme of reincarnation that we've talked about before, where one's karma propels their five skandhas to rearrange and reform into a new being in a new realm or in the same realm after they pass away. This scheme does not typically allow for ghosts or spirits. However, as Buddhism travels to China and Tibet, ghosts and spirits become a very real possibility in Buddhism due to its adaptation to and its appropriation of indigenous religions that already existed there. Tibetan indigenous religions used to have several conceptions of death which did allow for ghosts and spirits to exist. One of these was the idea that when somebody dies, they enter bardo, which is an intermediary space between this realm and the next, which is similar to limbo. And they believe that one must be guided out of this bardo through a series of rituals. Chinese religions had a similar idea that argued that if rites of ancestor worship were not kept to a certain standard of quality and regularity and frequency, that the spirits of the deceased would not rest well, and they would come back and wreak havoc on the world. These doctrines of death were absolutely synthesized with and incorporated into Buddhist doctrine and literature and ritual. When Buddhism gets to Japan, these doctrines come with it and are adapted, as well as they all adapt to and interact with Japanese traditions of kami worship, which we now collectively call Shinto. One doctrine that makes it easier for death rituals and memorial rituals to localize so heavily is the doctrine of merit transfer. We've talked about how karma is not owned by any individual on this show a lot. If I do something meritorious, like read a sutra, that is good karma for me because I've read the sutra, and it's good karma for you because you listened to it. The same idea is frequently applied to death rituals. Sutras are read and rituals are done to try and transfer some of the good karma and the merit of the actions of the living to the deceased person upon their death so that they can be propelled karmically into a better rebirth. Combine that with doctrines like ancestor worship and the idea of a limbo space like bardo, and we can have some very complicated death rituals and death doctrines that not only acknowledge, but actually assume that there is some lingering presence of the deceased that needs to be helped or dealt with in some way.
So, thinking about this in the lens of the five skandhas, you could perhaps say this is consciousness that is lingering?
In the case of these unique death doctrines that we see specifically in East Asia, there are lots of different theories as to what actually is left over. Some people think that it's consciousness, like you say. Others think that it is a different kind of form, like you say. And all of this depends, I think, also on the specific karma of the person who passed away, because there's ghosts and spirits which have different levels of sentience and consciousness and intelligence, and that functions in some specific literature in East Asia that deals with these ghosts and spirits. So the audience would be well aware of this system and be well steeped in how karma is related to the intelligence and the sentience of a spirit or a ghost of a deceased person. But that's a little bit more distant for us. We don't really have a lot that makes that make sense, especially since it's very syncretic of Buddhism and local indigenous religions that already existed there. So that being the case, it's a karmic imprint sometimes, but it could also just be a Taoist ghost or an ancestor spirit who is not resting easy, or somebody who didn't make it out of bardo. And it could be something that's really then not Buddhist at all, or at least not Buddhist in the strictest sense that their existence is documented and discussed in the sutras.
Okay, so this is kind of like a mix-up. So the answer is going to depend on who you ask, and the answer is also not necessarily going to be the flavor that we're thinking about usually with Buddhism. Okay, so let's get back to the script. So why are these conceptions of death and spirits and ghosts and death rituals important?
This is important because so much of Buddhist doctrine, in all of its iterations, is pointed towards the nature and meaning of death. In all accounts of the Buddha's life, seeing the corpse was one of the 3 sights or 4 sights, depending on who you ask, that caused Shakyamuni to leave the palace and his life as a prince to try and defeat sickness, old age, and death. Moreover, there are extremely early and therefore ubiquitous rituals, recitations, and contemplations in early Indian Buddhism that are related to death and are still practiced all over the world. These are rituals such as replicating the Buddha's funeral as it is laid out in the Mahaparinibbana Sutta, or meditations on one's own body as an animated corpse. This association with death does not lessen as Buddhism travels throughout East Asia, but actually increases significantly, due to there being existing death doctrines in the indigenous religions and cultures that we already talked about before. I mentioned the ideas, for example, of ancestor worship and on travel through limbo, but there are countless other localized death doctrines that get folded into Buddhist ritual. There are also developments within Buddhist doctrine which rely on reinterpretations of the texts by Buddhist thinkers, they rely on the production or the discovery of new texts by Buddhist thinkers, and they also rely on refinements in ritual functions carried out by Buddhists themselves in East Asia. This all shapes up Buddhism to be remarkable all throughout history for its close relationship with death. Other religions, like Brahmanical traditions in India or Shinto in Japan, typically regarded death and the dead to be morally and hygienically impure and pollutant, and so they tended not to engage with the dead very much. But Buddhism has no such doctrine, and so throughout history it's actually been Buddhists, commonly, who have served communities as funerary workers, who handle the dead and handle the rituals that happen after death. This is so true for Japanese Buddhism in particular that it becomes regarded as a funerary religion, meaning that it is a religion that centers only around funerals and death rituals, and not around any other type of life ritual. There are reasons for this development, and the categorization that we're talking about here is not entirely accurate, but the idea still points to the importance of death in Buddhism. There's a saying in Japan that says, "You're born Shinto, marry Christian, and die Buddhist," if you're a Japanese person. And this is pointing straight at the religious plurality of Japan, but also pointing straight at Buddhism's strong association with death in Japan. Christianity, for example, has 2 or maybe at best 3 places that you go when you die. These are heaven, hell, and sometimes purgatory. In Buddhism, there are 10 realms in this world of samsara alone, and there are also immeasurable heavens and pure lands in addition to that. Moreover, something we'll discuss later about this is that these death rituals constitute a huge portion of real lived Buddhist practice in the past and in the present.
How does this affect how Buddhism is practiced across East Asia?
As we've mentioned, there are a huge number of localizations to death rituals in Buddhism throughout East Asia, and I just want to describe some of them here. In India, Buddhists spent a lot of time, as instructed by the Buddha and his disciples, to meditate on charnel grounds, or places where the dead have been left. These places were regarded as dangerous and impure for Brahmanical traditions, but were a place where Buddhists could realize the non-dual relationship between their body and the bodies laid out upon the ground in front of them. Moreover, in Indian Buddhism and in other Buddhist traditions in East Asia, a great deal of effort was undertaken to replicate the funeral of the Buddha as it's described in the Parinibbana Sutta. This is usually done for more high-ranking monks or important individuals, but was adapted to a more cost-effective and feasible version for poorer people or for people in the clergy of less importance. This ritual, as you'll hear when we read and discuss the final part of the sutta, involved wrapping the body up in different types of cloth, cremating it, distributing leftover remains as relics to family and friends, and erecting a stupa over those remains for worship and veneration. The whole regimen of rituals would take 7 days after the Buddha died. And the idea here is that if the person dies like the Buddha and has this same regimen of rituals undertaken over their remains, then they are destined to become a Buddha after death, through this non-duality doctrine that we've talked about. In China, the same process was ubiquitous early on, but it syncretized with Tibetan traditions of guiding the deceased through a limbo period into the next rebirth with the use of a procession of torches or lanterns, the idea being that the individual would see the lights and know to follow them to the next life. There were also developments in the merit transfer rituals, which are too detailed for this episode, but are important nonetheless. These rituals are probably the most varied because China is very large and very diverse and has a very long history with regards to Buddhism. But one of the most important ones that we can mention is that the 7-day ritual gets lengthened to 49 days because of the inclusion of the rituals of ancestor worship and guiding the deceased through limbo. They also add memorial services and memorial rituals at 1 year, 3 years, and 33 years after the death of the person due to those same ancestor worship rules. In Japan, all of the things we have been discussing continue to play a part in death rituals, But some of the new developments include lengthening the memorial procession to guide the deceased out of the limbo space and increasing the amount of merit transferred to the deceased. When a person dies in Japanese Buddhism, some sects will undergo either the 7 or the 49-day ritual program, but they will also do the memorial rituals at 1, 3, and 33 years as well. The year intervals change in Japan depending on the sect, but those are nonetheless common. They also developed the idea that if the deceased was born into a better realm, then they would have some sort of supernatural or supramundane power necessary to appear to the living as a ghost, either in a vision or a dream or in something like that. If you had a dream of somebody after they passed, especially if it was in the first 49 days after they passed, then that was your sign that they had made it out of limbo and into a better rebirth. These are just some of the developments of death rituals in Buddhism in East Asia, and I encourage you to research more into death rituals that developed in China and Tibet, as those two areas are not my areas of expertise, and so I can't give nearly as detailed accounts of them as I can with regards to Japan. They have very vibrant and diverse cultures of death and histories of death rituals that are heavily influenced by Buddhism, but also by their own indigenous religions, and they absolutely should not be ignored.
We're going off script a little bit here, but I want to throw in a question about how hungry ghosts into the idea of ghosts and spirits in Buddhism. Are they an entirely different class of ghosts, or perhaps is ghost the wrong word to be using here?
So, the reason why we translate them specifically as ghosts is because there is a syncretism between the realm of hungry ghosts, or pretas as they're called in Sanskrit, and these lingering spirits and maybe demons, you might call them, that already exist in the cosmology of these local indigenous religions. So, starting early on in early Indian Buddhism, the realm of the hungry ghosts is where you go if you're extremely greedy in life, and if you have a lot of desire and you indulge and you act on that desire a lot, and you're very prideful and covetous and you want a lot, right? And whenever you're reborn as a hungry ghost, you're hungry. That means that you can't ever quench your thirst because water tastes like fire. You have to subsist on blood. There's all kinds of these awful, grisly things that make up the realm of hungry ghosts or pretas. These, in the early tradition, do not typically interact with the realm of humans or the realm of animals or anything like that. In fact, as far as I know, in early Indian Buddhism, the only interaction that exists between realms from a non-enlightened perspective specifically is between animals and humans. We can see animals, but we can't see any of the other inhabitants of these other realms unless we become enlightened, unless we study and practice and meditate such that we gain supramundane powers or supernatural powers, which include being able to see these inhabitants wherever they are. So that being the case, the hungry ghosts do not begin as conventional ghosts in early Buddhist doctrine. But then in China and in Japan, in the absence of Buddhism, in pre-Buddhist kami traditions, we have some sort of suspicion that there are doctrines that the deceased or some other incidents of negative energy or desire or greed that persists after somebody dies can then go on and attach themselves to an individual and wreak havoc on their lives. I'm sure that many of you have heard of yokai in Japanese culture. A yokai is a little demon or a little creature that you can't see but causes little random mischief in your life. If the TV clicks on whenever you're in your bed and you're far away from your living room where the TV would click on, then your explanation is like, oh, that must be a yokai. It's not somebody or something that can destroy your life in any major way, but it can cause these little weird things to happen. Or another example is that sometimes human beings, they just feel a sudden random wave of depression or exhaustion or anxiety or a sense of impending doom. And there are plenty of reasons that are circumstantial and specific that might cause those things. But another explanation for those things is that you've been bitten or you've been attacked or you've been attached to by a yokai or some other creature of this type. And because these creatures prey on our daily life energy and prey on our daily lives in some way, they become strongly associated with these hungry ghosts to the point where they're pretty much inseparable in Buddhist doctrine. So it's a later Mahayana East Asia development that we see that hungry ghosts actually interact and do stuff and mess with the realm of humans or of animals. And so that's probably where we get this translation of hungry ghost, because we didn't look at how they function in Indian Buddhism before the development of Mahayana. We're looking at them as they function in Chinese and Japanese culture during the early modern period, where we're getting a lot of these textual sources from. And so they're kind of their own little syncretic creatures unto themselves. And in fact, just because they're small and just because they don't really screw up our lives that much, there's still actually large-scale rituals that are performed just to pacify and placate them and send them off to a better realm. So in Japan in particular, there are entire large-scale community-based rituals which are to pray for the salvation of the hungry ghosts and to facilitate their rebirth in a better realm, one, so that they take care of themselves and hear the Dharma and become Buddhas in the future and so on and so forth, but also to maintain the health and safety and just the general well-being of the society of living individuals, so that they're not bothered and plagued and afflicted by the actions of these little creatures that will mess up their lives in some way.
Okay, so hungry ghosts is another instance of a perhaps questionable translation, similar to how we've talked about with dukkha as suffering.
Exactly, yeah. These translations are very culturally charged and are very interpretive in their own way, and so we should always look twice at them if we can. And especially if we can't look twice at the translation because we don't have the language skills, we should at least look at some of the visual cultures that exist surrounding pretas. It's almost indistinguishable between these pretas and between angry ancestors in Chinese culture or between yokai in Japanese culture. And you'll start to see them fuse together in these little demons that they have distended bellies and they have like blue skin, and like I said before, they drink blood and so on and so forth.
We hope you enjoyed our discussion of spirits and ghosts in Buddhism, and also an unscripted discussion of Preta in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will discuss idle chatter and social relationships. How does one actually maintain social relationships while avoiding idle chatter? What actually is idle chatter? How does that apply to lay people and monks similarly and differently? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
See you next time. Thank you for listening. My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have a question you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment or review, subscribing, or joining us on social media. Email us at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com or tweet us at brightbuddhism. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.